The chains bit into Savannah Keene's wrists as she stood trembling on the crude wooden platform, the midday Arizona sun beating mercilessly against her dirt-streaked face. June 1878 had brought nothing but misfortune since the stagecoach attack that killed her traveling companions and left her at the mercy of outlaws, who saw profit in selling a young woman to the highest bidder. Around her, the frontier town of Copper Creek buzzed with the usual Saturday commotion: miners spending their week's earnings, cowboys between cattle drives seeking entertainment, and businessmen in pressed suits pretending not to look interested in the human merchandise. The makeshift auction block had been hastily erected behind the town's largest saloon, hidden enough from decent society but accessible to those with coin and questionable intentions. "What about this one? Fine breeding stock," bellowed the auctioneer, a greasy-haired man with tobacco-stained teeth. He yanked Savannah forward by the chain connecting her shackles. "Bid on the quiet side, but that might be a blessing for some of you boys." Laughter rippled through the crowd of 24 men. Savannah kept her eyes downcast, her lips pressed together in the same silence she'd maintained since her capture 3 weeks prior. She'd quickly learned that words only invited more cruelty. At the back of the gathering, Mason Murphy leaned against a hitching post, his worn leather vest and dust-covered boots marking him as just another cowhand passing through. But the intensity in his gray eyes betrayed something different as they fixed on the woman being sold like cattle. "Starting bid is $50, called the auctioneer. "Look at that golden hair, those fine features. Educated too, I'd wager." "40, called a miner already half-drunk before noon. "I said 50, Jenkins, can't you hear?" snapped the auctioneer. 50 to start." 50, offered a man in a gaudy suit, owner of the neighboring saloon. Mason straightened, his hand instinctively touching the six-shooter at his hip. He'd come to Copper Creek looking for work, not trouble. 5 years of drifting since the war had taught him to mind his own business. But something about the woman's dignity, even in chains, stirred something he thought had died on a battlefield in Virginia. 65, called another voice. 75, countered the saloon owner. The bidding continued, the price climbing as Savannah stood motionless, her spirit seemingly as shackled as her wrists. But Mason caught at the almost imperceptible tremble of her lower lip, the way her fingers curled into fists when the auctioneer grabbed her arm to show her off from all angles. She wasn't broken, just imprisoned in her own silence. $100, called the saloon owner, a smug smile crossing his face as the other bidders fell silent, going once. The auctioneer began. 200, Mason's voice cut through the crowd, surprising even himself. All heads turned. The saloon owner squinted at Mason, evaluating his threadbare appearance. 250, the saloon owner countered, clearly irritated. Mason stepped forward, moving through the parting crowd. 300. The sum represented nearly everything he had saved from his last cattle drive. For the first time, Savannah's eyes lifted, meeting his. There was no hope in them, only wary curiosity. The saloon owner scoffed. 500. A murmur rippled through the crowd. It was an extraordinary sum for an auction of this nature. Mason's jaw tightened. He had only $327 to his name. He glanced at Savannah again, at the bruises peeking out from beneath her torn sleeve, at the quiet defiance in her posture despite everything. "I don't have 500, Mason announced clearly, stepping onto the platform. "But I do have this." He drew his gun, not pointing it at anyone but making his possession of it clear. "And a suggestion that this auction is over, as it shouldn't have begun in the first place." The auctioneer backed away. "Now see here, no, you see here," Mason cut him off. "Selling people ended with the war. I was there when it ended and I aim to keep it that way." "She's just a woman with no people," the auctioneer protested. "Found her with dead folks on the trail ain't no crime." "It's kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment," Mason countered, "and I suspect the territorial marshal might have thoughts about that." He turned to address the crowd. "Anyone here want to explain to Marshal Davis why you're bidding on a human being?" The mention of the notorious strict marshal caused several men to drift away immediately. The saloon owner lingered, his face darkening with anger. "You're making an enemy today, Cowboy," he warned. "Won't be my first," Mason replied evenly. He turned to the auctioneer. "The key." After a moment's hesitation, the man produced a small iron key from his pocket. Mason snatched it and quickly unlocked Savannah's shackles, letting them fall to the platform with a clatter. She rubbed her raw wrists, still silent, her eyes now fixed on Mason with an unreadable expression. "Can you walk?" he asked her quietly. She nodded. "Then I suggest we leave before someone decides this interruption isn't to their liking." Mason guided her off the platform, one hand hovering near the small of her back without touching her, the other still holding his gun casually but ready. The remaining crowd parted, no one quite willing to challenge him directly. His horse, a sturdy chestnut gelding named Chief, stood hitched nearby. Mason helped Savannah mount, then swung up behind her. He felt her stiffen at the proximity but had no other option. "I know you've no reason to trust me," he said softly as they rode out of town at an unhurried pace designed not to attract more attention. "But I promise you're not trading one captor for another. First safe town we reach, you're free to go your own way." Savannah remained silent, but the rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly. It was enough for now. They rode for hours, following the winding trail that led north through scrubby desert terrain. Mason kept them at a steady pace, mindful of the added weight on Chief and the need to preserve the horse's stamina. Occasionally he glanced over his shoulder, but no pursuers appeared on the horizon. As the sun began to set, Mason guided them toward a small creek he remembered from previous travels. The cottonwood trees provided shelter, and the running water would refresh both them and the horse. He dismounted first, then offered a hand to help Savannah down. She hesitated before accepting it, her first voluntary touch revealing soft hands not accustomed to rough frontier life. "I'll start a fire," Mason said, busying himself with gathering kindling to give her space. "There's jerky in my saddlebag if you're hungry." Savannah walked to the creek edge, kneeling to splash water on her face. The cool liquid washed away layers of dust and tears, revealing a youthful complexion that Mason guessed placed her in her early 20s, perhaps a few years younger than his 30. When she returned to the small camp he'd arranged, Mason handed her a bandana. "It's clean," he assured her as she hesitantly took it to dry her face. The fire crackled to life, and Mason set a small pot of coffee to boil. He'd learned long ago that the ritual of coffee making helped establish normalcy in even the strangest situations. As the familiar aroma filled the air, he saw Savannah's shoulders relax further. "You don't have to talk," Mason said, while slicing jerky with his hunting knife. "But I'd like to know your name if you're willing." For a long moment he thought she would maintain her silence. Then her lips parted and she cleared her throat as if remembering how to use her voice. "Savannah," she whispered, the sound barely audible over the crackling fire. "Savannah Keene." Mason nodded, offering a small smile. "Mason Murphy, most folks just call me Mace." "Why?" The single word seemed to surprise even her, as if it had escaped without permission. "Why the name or why I helped you?" he asked, handing her a strip of jerky. "Both," Savannah replied, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "Mace is just shorter than Mason," he explained. "As for helping you," he poked at the fire, sending sparks into the darkening sky. "Let's just say I've seen enough people in chains to last several lifetimes." Savannah studied him, really looked at him for the first time. His face was weathered from years under the sun, with lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he once smiled more than he did now. A scar ran along his jawline, disappearing into his short beard. His clothes were worn but clean, his movements efficient like a man accustomed to taking care of himself. "Thank you," she said finally, the words carrying the weight of everything she couldn't express. Mason nodded, acknowledging the depth behind her simple thanks. "You should rest. We've got a long ride tomorrow if we want to reach Silver Springs." What's in Silver Springs? Law, proper law, not the kind that looks the other way during human auctions. He poured coffee into a tin cup and handed it to her. And a stagecoach station. You can decide where to go from there. Savannah accepted the cup, warming her hands around it. I have nowhere to go, she admitted. My parents died of fever 2 years ago in Boston. I was traveling west to take a position as a school teacher in Sacramento when our stagecoach was attacked. She stared into the coffee. Everyone else was killed immediately. The men who took me said I'd fetch a good price, being educated and… She trailed off, unable to continue. You don't need to explain, Mason assured her. Get some rest, you're safe tonight. That night, Savannah slept fitfully under Mason's spare blanket while he kept watch, his back against a cottonwood trunk. Hat pulled low over his eyes but senses alert. Several times she woke with a start, momentarily panicked until remembering her rescue. Each time, she found Mason in the same position, a reassuring presence in the wilderness. When morning came, they ate a simple breakfast of hardtack and the last of the coffee before continuing their journey. Savannah sat behind Mason this time, hesitantly placing her hands on his waist for balance as Chief navigated the increasingly rocky terrain. Have you always been a cowboy? She asked as the morning wore on, her voice growing stronger with each passing hour. Mason adjusted his hat against the sun. Not always. Grew up on a small farm in Missouri, then the war came and after that, well, seemed easier to keep moving. The war changed many things, she observed softly. That it did, he agreed. What about you? Always wanted to be a school teacher. Savannah's grip tightened slightly as Chief navigated down a steep embankment. My mother was a teacher. I helped her with the younger children and found I had a knack for it. When the position in Sacramento was advertised, it seemed like a chance for a fresh start after losing them. Still could be, Mason suggested. Silver Springs might need a teacher. They rode in companionable silence for a while, the rhythmic hoofbeats and occasional call of a hawk the only sounds disturbing the vast landscape. Around midday, Mason pulled Chief to an abrupt halt, his posture suddenly alert. What is it? Savannah whispered, sensing his tension. Riders, behind us. He guided Chief off the trail and behind a large rock formation. 3, maybe 4. Mason helped Savannah dismount and led the horse deeper into the rocky shelter. Stay here, he instructed, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. Is it them? The men from the auction? Fear crept back into her voice. Can't be sure, but we can't take chances. He checked the rifle's chamber. If anything happens to me, take Chief and follow the trail north. Don't stop until you reach Silver Springs. Before she could protest, Mason moved to a position where he could observe the trail without being seen. Minutes later, 4 riders appeared, moving at a determined pace. Even from a distance, Mason recognized the saloon owner from Copper Creek among them. He watched as they paused at the fork in the trail, examining the ground for signs of passage. One pointed north, while another gestured east. After a heated discussion, they split up 2 heading north, including the saloon owner, and 2 turning east. Mason returned to Savannah, who stood anxiously beside Chief, her hand stroking the horse's neck for comfort. It's the men from Copper Creek, he confirmed. 2 have continued north, 2 went east. We need to change our plan. What should we do? Mason considered their options. There's an old mining camp west of here. It was abandoned last year when the silver ran out, but the buildings are still standing. We could shelter there until they give up the search. Savannah nodded, trusting his judgment. They mounted again, Mason leading Chief through a narrow canyon that wouldn't show tracks as clearly as the dusty trail. Progress was slower through the rough terrain, but by late afternoon they reached the abandoned mining camp nestled against a hillside. The camp consisted of a dozen weathered wooden structures, a combination of small cabins, a cookhouse, and what had been the company's store. Most had fallen into disrepair, but a few remained relatively intact. Mason selected a cabin at the far edge of the camp, with a clear view of the approach and the surrounding hills. Inside was sparse a metal-framed bed with a straw mattress, a table with one chair, and a small potbelly stove. "Not exactly luxury accommodations," Mason apologized, clearing cobwebs from the window. "It has a roof and walls," Savannah replied with a small smile. "After weeks of sleeping on the ground with chains, this feels like a palace." Mason found enough kindling to start a fire in the stove, taking the chill from the mountain air as evening approached. He unpacked their meager supplies, laying out the last of the jerky and some dried apples. "I need to check the perimeter and see to Chief," he said. "Will you be all right for a few minutes?" Savannah nodded, settling into the room's only chair. When Mason returned half an hour later, he found her asleep, head resting on her folded arms on the table. He gently draped his coat over her shoulders, the movement causing her to stir. "Sorry," she murmured, straightening. "I didn't mean to fall asleep." "You need the rest," he assured her. "Take the bed, I'll keep watch." Savannah looked at the bed, then back at Mason. "You've been riding and watching over me for 2 days. You need rest too?" Mason shook his head. "I've gone longer without sleep." "During the war?" she asked softly. He nodded, his expression closing off slightly. "And after?" Savannah studied him, sensing the weight of memories he carried. "Were you an officer, Sergeant, Union Army, 8th Missouri Volunteer Infantry?" His tone suggested he didn't often discuss this part of his past. "Saw action at Shiloh, Vicksburg, and a half-dozen other places better forgotten." "Is that why you wander? To forget?" Mason stared out the small window into the gathering darkness. "Maybe at first, now it's just what I know." He turned back to her. "You should get some sleep. Tomorrow we'll need to decide our next move." Savannah reluctantly moved to the bed but didn't lie down. "Will you tell me something, Mason? The truth?" He nodded, curious. "Those men following us, they're dangerous, aren't they?" "More dangerous than you're letting on." Mason considered softening the reality, but decided she deserved honesty. "Yes. The saloon owner, they call him Garrett, has a reputation. He's not just after his lost investment. Men like him can't stand being publicly challenged." "So he wants revenge on you," she concluded. "I've put you in danger." "You didn't put me anywhere," Mason corrected gently. "I made my choice when I stepped onto that auction platform." "Why?" The question that had clearly been troubling her finally emerged. "Why would you risk everything for a stranger?" Mason sat on the edge of the table, his expression thoughtful. "During the war, I saw a slave auction in Tennessee. We were passing through a town not yet under Union control. Couldn't intervene without compromising our mission." His voice grew distant with memory. "There was a woman, not much older than you, standing on the block with her child, the look in her eyes, I've never forgotten it. When I saw you standing there with that same look, I couldn't walk away. Not again." Savannah's eyes glistened in the dim light from the stove. "Thank you for telling me." She hesitated, then added, "and for not walking away." The night passed quietly, with Mason taking brief naps while maintaining his vigilance. By morning, a light rain had begun to fall, shrouding the abandoned camp in mist. "The rain will help hide our tracks," Mason observed, heating coffee on the stove. "But it also means we can't see if anyone's approaching." Savannah joined him at the window, standing close enough that her arm brushed his. The casual contact no longer made her flinch as it had just yesterday. "What's our plan?" she asked, accepting a cup of coffee. "We need supplies." "I'm going to check the other buildings, see if anything useful was left behind." He handed her his pistol. "Ever fired one of these?" She shook her head. "It's simple enough. Point and squeeze the trigger, 6 shots. He demonstrated how to hold it. "Stay here. If anyone besides me tries to come through that door." "I understand," she said, though her hand trembled slightly as she took the weapon. Mason spent the next hour searching the abandoned buildings. He returned with an assortment of items, some canned goods forgotten in the company store, a woman's shawl, a few tins of matches, and most valuable, a small box of ammunition that matched his rifle. "Not much, but it'll help," he said, laying out his findings. "Found something else too. There's a tunnel entrance in the back of the mine office. Looks like it connects to the main shaft higher up the hill. Could be an escape route if needed." They spent the day in the cabin, the rain continuing steadily outside. Mason repaired a leak in the roof, while Savannah fashioned a broom from twigs to sweep out the worst of the dust and debris. The domestic activity felt strangely normal in their abnormal circumstances. As evening approached, the rain finally stopped. Mason stepped outside to check on Chief and scan the surroundings. The wet landscape glistened in the fading light, peaceful and seemingly deserted. He returned to find Savannah heating one of the cans of beans over the stove. She'd arranged their scavenged items neatly and had even found an old crate to serve as a second chair. "You've been busy," he observed with approval. "Seemed better than sitting and worrying." She offered a small smile. "Though I did plenty of that too." They shared the meal in comfortable silence, both aware of how quickly they'd developed a rapport that belied their short acquaintance. When Savannah accidentally brushed his hand while passing the canteen, neither pulled away immediately. "Tell me about your life before," Mason said as darkness fell outside. "In Boston." Savannah's face brightened at the memory. "We lived near the harbor. Father was an accountant for a shipping company. Mother taught at the local school." She described concerts in the park, ice skating in winter, and her father's terrible jokes that always made them laugh despite themselves. "It sounds like a good life," Mason said softly. "It was." Her voice grew wistful. "After they died, the house went to pay debts. I stayed with a friend's family while teaching assistant positions, but it never felt like home again." She looked up at him. "What about your family?" Mason's expression grew distant. "Farm was lost during the war. Father died at Antietam fighting for the Confederacy." He noted Savannah's surprised look. "Yes, my father fought for the South while I fought for the North. Missouri was complicated. And your mother remarried after the war, lives in St. Louis with her new husband. We exchange letters at Christmas." His tone suggested there was more to the story, but he didn't elaborate. "No siblings." "Had a brother, younger, Thomas." Mason's voice grew softer. "Lost him at Shiloh, wrong place, wrong time." Savannah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I'm sorry." Mason looked at their hands, then turned his palm up to clasp hers. The simple human connection felt profound after years of keeping people at arm's length. The moment was shattered by the distant sound of voices. Mason was instantly alert, moving to the window while drawing his rifle. "3 riders entering the camp from the east," he whispered. "Get your things. We need to use that tunnel." They quickly gathered their meager belongings. Mason extinguished the stove and led Savannah out the back door, staying low and moving from building to building until they reached the mine office. The tunnel entrance was partially collapsed, requiring them to crawl through a narrow opening. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the darkness absolute once they were beyond the entrance. "Stay close," Mason instructed, lighting a match to get his bearings. They moved slowly through the tunnel, Mason leading the way with one hand holding a match and the other maintaining contact with Savannah. The passage gradually widened and rose until they could stand upright, following the natural contours of the hillside. "What about Chief?" Savannah whispered as they paused to light another match. "Had to leave him," Mason admitted regretfully. "But I hit his saddle and turned him loose. He's a smart horse, he'll avoid strangers." After what felt like hours of navigating the twisting passages, they reached a junction where fresh air suggested an exit. Mason extinguished the match and moved forward cautiously, Savannah's hand gripping the back of his vest. The tunnel opened onto a ledge halfway up the hillside, obscured by pine trees and offering a view of the camp below. In the moonlight, they could see 3 men searching the buildings, lanterns flickering in the darkness. "Garrett's men," Mason confirmed grimly. "We need to put more distance between us." They carefully descended the rocky slope on the far side of the hill, away from the camp. The night was clear and cold, the stars providing just enough light to navigate by. Mason kept them moving until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. They found shelter in a rocky overhang near a small spring. Exhausted, Savannah sank to the ground, her dress torn and dirty from their escape through the tunnel. Mason wasn't in much better shape, his face streaked with dirt and a fresh cut on his hand from a sharp rock. "Let me see that," Savannah said, noticing the blood on his palm. Mason hesitated, then extended his hand. She tore a strip from her petticoat and dipped it in the spring, gently cleaning the wound before binding it. "You have a gentle touch," Mason observed as she worked. "Mother always said I should have been a nurse instead of a teacher," she replied with a small smile. "But the sight of blood made me queasy. Seems I've overcome that recently." "Necessity has a way of changing us," he agreed. They rested through the morning, taking turns keeping watch while the others slept. By midday, Mason had determined their position and plotted a route to the nearest settlement, a small farming community called Willow Creek. "It's about 15 miles northeast," he explained as they shared the last of the canned beans. "Not much more than a general store, livery stable, and a dozen farms, but they're good people. I worked a harvest there 2 years ago. Can we make it by nightfall?" Savannah asked, eyeing the rugged terrain ahead. Mason shook his head. "Not on foot. We'll need to find somewhere to shelter tonight and continue tomorrow." They set out as the afternoon cooled, following a deer trail that wound through pine forest and rocky meadows. Mason kept them moving at a steady pace, occasionally stopping to check for signs of pursuit. As dusk approached, they came upon an abandoned line shack, a simple one-room structure used by cowboys when working distant parts of a ranch. The door hung askew on leather hinges, but the roof appeared intact. "Not much, but it'll keep the night chill off," Mason said, inspecting the interior. The shack contained a crude bunk built into one wall, a small table, and the remains of a fireplace. Mason gathered wood while Savannah cleared away years of accumulated leaves and debris. With a fire crackling in the hearth, the small space quickly warmed. They sat side by side on the edge of the bunk, sharing the last of their water and a handful of dried apples. "Mason." Savannah's voice was soft in the firelight. "What happens when we reach Willow Creek?" He studied the flames. "They'll help us contact the territorial marshal about what happened in Copper Creek. You'll be safe there until you decide what you want to do next. And you?" She turned to look at him directly. "What will you do next?" Mason hadn't allowed himself to think that far ahead. "What I always do, I suppose, find work, keep moving. Always alone." The question hung in the air between them. "Been that way for 5 years, he replied, meeting her gaze. "Seems easier." "Easier isn't always better," Savannah said gently. She reached up to touch his face, her fingers tracing the scar along his jaw. "The war's been over for 13 years, Mason." He caught her hand in his, intending to pull it away, but instead found himself holding it against his chest. "Some wars never end, Savannah." "They can," she whispered, leaning closer, "if you let them." When their lips met, it was hesitant at first, both surprised by the intensity of feeling that had developed in such a short time. Then Mason's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her closer as the kiss deepened. They separated slowly, foreheads touching as they caught their breath. Mason brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch reverent. "I haven't felt anything like this in a very long time," he admitted. "Neither have I," Savannah replied. "Ever." The night passed in quiet conversation punctuated by lingering touches and soft kisses. They spoke of childhoods, dreams abandoned and rediscovered, and the strange twist of fate that had brought them together. "I believe things happen for a reason," Savannah said as they lay side by side on the narrow bunk, hands intertwined. "Even terrible things sometimes lead to something good." "Like a woman being chained and auctioned leading to this moment?" Mason asked skeptically. "Like a lonely cowboy finding someone who helps him remember how to feel," she corrected, turning to look at him in the dying firelight. Morning arrived with clear skies and the distant call of meadowlarks. They set out for Willow Creek with renewed energy, their hands frequently finding each other as they walked. By mid-afternoon, the landscape began to change, with scattered farmhouses appearing in the distance. They stopped at the first farm they reached, where an older couple immediately offered assistance upon hearing a simplified version of their situation. "Outlaws, eh?" the farmer said, shaking his head. "Been too much of that since they closed the army post at Fort Kendall." He hitched his wagon to take them into town. "Sheriff Miller needs to hear about this." Willow Creek proved to be exactly as Mason had described, a small but welcoming community centered around a dusty main street with a general store, blacksmith, small church, and combination sheriff's office and jail. Sheriff Miller was a gray-haired man with a perpetually stern expression that belied his compassionate nature. He listened carefully to their full account, taking detailed notes. "This Garrett character's been causing trouble all through the territory," he confirmed. "Marshal Davis has been building a case against him for months. Your testimony might be just what he needs." He arranged rooms for them at the boarding house run by the widow Carson, who fussed over Savannah like a mother hen, providing clean clothes and a hot bath that seemed like unimaginable luxury after their ordeal. That evening, as they sat on the boarding house porch watching the sunset, Mason seemed uncharacteristically nervous. "Sheriff Miller offered me a job," he said finally. "Deputy position, says the town's growing and he needs help." Savannah's heart quickened. "Are you considering it?" "Depends." He turned to face her directly. "Sheriff also mentioned they're looking for a schoolteacher. The current one's moving to Denver next month. Are you asking me to stay in Willow Creek?" Savannah asked, unable to keep the hope from her voice. Mason took her hands in his. "I'm asking if you'd consider staying. With me, I know it's fast and probably foolish, but these past days have shown me what I've been missing all these years." Savannah's smile brightened her entire face. "I don't think it's foolish at all." She squeezed his hands. "I was silent for weeks, trapped in fear and despair. You didn't just break my chains, Mason, you helped me find my voice again. And you," he said softly, "broke through a loneliness I'd convinced myself was permanent." Their kiss sealed an unspoken promise, witnessed only by the fading light of day and the first emerging stars. 2 weeks later, Marshal Davis arrived with a posse and warrants for Garrett and his associates. Savannah's testimony, along with Mason's, provided the evidence needed to shut down the illegal operations in Copper Creek. Chief returned unexpectedly the day after the marshal's departure, appearing at the livery stable as if he'd never been away. Mason considered it a sign that they were exactly where they were meant to be. By December, Mason had settled into his role as deputy, while Savannah took charge of Willow Creek's 16 school children, quickly becoming beloved for her patient teaching style and creative approach to lessons. They married on Christmas Eve in the small church, with the entire town turning out to celebrate. Sheriff Miller stood as Mason's best man, and the widow Carson helped Savannah prepare for her new life. As winter gave way to spring, they moved into a small house on the edge of town, with enough land for a garden and room to build. Mason hung up his drifter's hat for good, finding in Savannah and their shared life together the peace that had eluded him since the war. "You ever regret it?" Savannah asked one evening as they sat on their porch, watching fireflies dance in the gathering twilight. "Stopping at that auction, getting involved," Mason drew her closer, his arm around her shoulders. "Not for a single moment." He pressed a kiss to her temple. "Some chains are meant to be broken." "And some bonds," Savannah replied, placing his hand over her heart, "are meant to be formed." In the years that followed, their family grew with the addition of 2 children who would never know the loneliness that had marked their parents' earlier lives. Mason and Savannah Murphy became fixtures in Willow Creek, their unusual beginning transforming into a legacy of compassion and community service that would define the growing town for generations to come. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, they would sit together under the stars and marvel at how the darkest day of Savannah's life had ultimately led to their greatest happiness, proof that even in the wild and often cruel frontier, love could break the strongest chains and heal the deepest wounds.